Amira had barely stepped onto the stone walkway leading to the chapel when her father planted himself directly in front of her. "You're not going in dressed like that." His voice was low enough that most guests couldn't hear, but loud enough that nearby relatives slowed their conversations and turned to look. Amira glanced down at her army dress uniform, smoothing the sleeve almost instinctively. Every ribbon was perfectly aligned. Every medal sat exactly where regulations required. She had worn this uniform to ceremonies, memorials, promotions, and funerals. Never had she imagined she'd be told she couldn't wear it to her own sister's wedding. Her mother hurried over, eyes fixed on the Distinguished Service Medal resting above Amira's heart. "Take it off," Diane whispered sharply. "Go change before anyone notices. I'm already dressed. Don't make us look bad." The words landed harder than Amira expected. "My uniform makes you look bad?" she asked quietly. Her father folded his arms. "People are here to celebrate your sister, not stare at you. If you walk in wearing that, everyone will spend the day asking questions." Amira searched both of their faces, hoping one of them would smile and admit this was some terrible joke. Neither did. "If you won't change," Robert said, "we'll have security escort you out." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Amira lifted her chin. "I earned this uniform," she said. "I'm not taking it off." Neither of her parents moved. The standoff lasted just long enough for several arriving guests to notice something was wrong. Only then did Robert step aside. "Fine," he muttered. "Just don't tell anyone what you do." Amira walked past them without another word, unaware that one guest inside the chapel had already noticed the medal on her chest. She had replayed that conversation dozens of times during the drive to the venue. 3 days earlier, her parents had called. Her mother hadn't asked how work was going. She hadn't asked whether Amira had made it home safely after traveling across the country. Instead, the first thing she'd said was, "We need to discuss your outfit." When Amira reminded her she planned to wear her army dress uniform, silence filled the phone before her father took over. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "It isn't appropriate. It's the formal uniform. It draws attention." When Amira pointed out that wedding guests often wore military uniforms at formal ceremonies, her father answered with the sentence she couldn't forget. "Don't make us look bad." She had almost laughed then. Almost. Instead, she'd asked the question that had lingered for years. "When have I ever embarrassed this family?" Neither parent answered directly. Her mother simply repeated that the wedding was about Emily, not about military decorations. The conversation ended with a warning. "If you show up wearing that uniform," her father had said, "don't expect us to defend you." Now, standing inside the beautifully decorated chapel, Amira understood they hadn't been bluffing. Her parents barely acknowledged her presence. Relatives greeted Emily's college achievements, complimented cousins on new jobs, admired expensive suits and elegant dresses. When someone introduced Amira, her mother smiled politely and said only, "She lives out of state." Nothing about the army. Nothing about serving for nearly a decade. Nothing about deployments. Nothing about the medals quietly resting on her chest. It wasn't new. Her parents had skipped promotion ceremonies because they were too busy. Family photo albums somehow never included pictures taken in uniform. Whenever relatives asked about her career, the conversation somehow shifted back to Emily. Emily herself had never asked for the comparison. She hugged Amira warmly before disappearing to finish getting ready. "I'm really glad you came," she whispered. "So am I." For a moment, Amira wondered whether leaving would actually make everyone's day easier. Maybe she should drive back to the hotel before the ceremony started. Maybe her parents were right. Maybe the uniform was becoming a distraction. She looked down one last time. Every ribbon represented years she could never get back. Every medal represented people she'd served beside. If she walked away now, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering why she'd apologized for earning them. So she stayed. Her parents noticed. Her father walked past and spoke without looking at her. "Remember what we said." Then he disappeared toward the front row. As guests continued filling the chapel, Amira quietly took a seat near the side aisle. Across the room, several older men wearing small veteran lapel pins glanced toward her. Most simply nodded with quiet recognition. One elderly gentleman did something different. He stared directly at the Distinguished Service Medal. His expression changed completely. Slowly, he rose from his chair. Leaning lightly on his cane, he crossed the aisle until he stopped in front of Amira. The room around them seemed to fade. He looked from her face back to the medal. Then he asked, almost in disbelief, "Captain, where did you earn that Distinguished Service Medal?" For a brief moment, Amira considered giving the same answer she usually gave strangers. It was overseas. Simple, polite, enough to end the conversation. Instead, she met the elderly man's eyes. "During a humanitarian operation," she replied, "several years ago." He studied her face for another second before giving a slow nod. "I thought so." Before Amira could ask what he meant, her mother appeared beside them, wearing the tight smile Amira had seen her use for years whenever she wanted to control a conversation. "Oh, Mr. Whitaker," Diane said cheerfully, slipping between them. "I'm sure Captain Brooks doesn't want to spend the wedding talking about work." The older man looked at Diane, then back at Amira. "I was only asking where she served. And she's far too modest to make a fuss," Diane answered quickly. "Besides, we're all here for Emily." Without waiting for a response, Diane lightly touched Mr. Whitaker's arm and guided him toward another group of guests. "Come meet my cousins. They've been hoping to speak with you." As they walked away, Mr. Whitaker glanced back over his shoulder. Not at Amira. At the medal. Emily found Amira a few minutes later near one of the stained glass windows. "What was that about?" she asked quietly. "I honestly don't know." Emily frowned. "I've never seen Mom interrupt someone that fast." Neither had Amira. Emily hesitated before lowering her voice. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why have Mom and Dad always acted so uncomfortable whenever you wear your uniform?" Amira let out a small breath. "I wish I knew." Emily looked genuinely confused. "When I was little, I thought it was because they worried about you being deployed." She paused. But after a while, it didn't feel like worry anymore. It wasn't. Emily looked down at her bouquet. "I remember your promotion ceremony." Amira smiled faintly. "You came." "I did." Emily swallowed. "They didn't." "No. They told me you didn't mind." Amira didn't answer, because she had minded. Very much. Standing there, memories arrived one after another. The family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Every graduation photo. Every birthday picture. Every holiday gathering. But somehow, none of the framed photographs showed her in uniform. Whenever she mailed professional military portraits home, they disappeared into drawers instead of onto walls. Whenever relatives asked what she did for a living, her father answered before she could. "She works in logistics." Technically true, just never the whole truth. Her deployments became business trips. Her ceremonies became work obligations. Even her years of service were reduced to what her mother always called that phase. As guests continued arriving, several cousins wandered over. "So what are you doing these days?" one asked. Before Amira could answer, Robert appeared beside them carrying a tray of programs. "She's still traveling for work." "Oh," the cousin said. "What kind of work?" Robert smiled. "Nothing exciting." Amira caught herself gripping the edge of the chair. "Nothing exciting. Years spent serving. Friends she'd lost. Families she'd helped. Reduced to 2 words. She simply excused herself before anger could find its way into her voice. Across the chapel, Mr. Whitaker had taken a seat again. But he wasn't watching the ceremony preparations. He was watching Amira. A few moments later, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He typed carefully, sent one message, then another. Within minutes, phones quietly buzzed at different tables around the room. One by one, several older guests, men and women wearing subtle veterans pins, looked toward Amira. None approached. None spoke. They simply exchanged quiet glances. Amira noticed the movement but assumed they were old friends coordinating seating arrangements. She had no idea every message contained the same question. Could that really be Captain Amira Brooks? Near the back row, one veteran looked toward the front, shook his head in amazement, and spoke just loudly enough for the others nearby to hear. "If that's who I think she is." He slowly rose from his chair. "Everyone here deserves to know." The wedding ceremony passed without incident. Emily and her husband exchanged vows. The guests applauded. Family photos were taken beneath the flower arch, and by early evening everyone had moved into the ballroom for the reception. Soft music filled the room as waiters carried trays of champagne between nearly 180 guests. For the first time all day, Amira thought perhaps the tension was over. She sat near the back of the ballroom, exactly where her parents had suggested, far enough away that no one would notice her. It didn't last. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone before inviting family members to offer toasts. Emily's maid of honor spoke first, then the groom's brother. Laughter rolled through the room. As the MC prepared to introduce the next speaker, a calm voice interrupted. "Excuse me." Every head turned. Mr. Whitaker had risen from his chair. Leaning on his cane, he smiled politely. "If the bride and groom don't mind, I'd like to say a few words." Emily glanced at her husband. He nodded immediately. "Of course," Emily replied. The microphone was handed to the elderly gentleman. Robert shifted uneasily. Diane's smile disappeared. Neither of them had expected this. Mr. Whitaker looked across the ballroom until his eyes settled on Amira. "Captain Brooks." Amira looked up, surprised. "Would you mind standing for just a moment?" The room grew noticeably quieter. Conversation stopped. Forks paused halfway to plates. Amira hesitated. She wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, especially after everything her parents had said, but refusing would only create more questions. Slowly, she stood. Mr. Whitaker smiled warmly. "Thank you." He turned back to the guests. "I noticed Captain Brooks' Distinguished Service Medal before today's ceremony." A ripple of whispers moved across the ballroom. Several guests instinctively looked toward Amira's chest. Diane stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker?" she interrupted with forced laughter. "I'm sure everyone would rather continue celebrating the wedding." He acknowledged her with a respectful nod. "And that's exactly what I'm doing." Then he looked at Amira again. "Captain, may I share something?" Amira answered quietly. "If you think it's appropriate." "I do." Mr. Whitaker rested both hands on the microphone. "Many people recognize military uniforms." He paused. "Far fewer recognize the medals." He pointed, not dramatically, but carefully. "That medal isn't given for simply doing one's job." The ballroom became completely still. "It represents extraordinary service under extraordinary circumstances." No one spoke. Even the band had stopped preparing for the next song. Robert stepped closer. "I really don't think this is necessary." Mr. Whitaker continued as though he hadn't heard him. "I've attended military ceremonies for more than 40 years. He smiled softly. "And I've only seen that medal worn a handful of times." Guests exchanged puzzled looks. Some searched their phones beneath the tables. Others simply stared at Amira. She wished she could disappear. Near one corner of the ballroom, an older woman wearing a veteran's pin slowly pushed back her chair. She stood, without saying a word. Across another table, a retired Marine stood beside her. Then a former Air Force pilot, a Navy veteran, an Army sergeant major, another woman who had served overseas. One after another, chairs slid backward across the polished floor. The movement spread through the ballroom with quiet purpose. Guests watched in confusion as veterans seated throughout the reception rose to their feet. Amira counted without meaning to. 3, 5, 7, 9. Mr. Whitaker lowered the microphone. The 9 veterans turned together. Not toward the bride, not toward the stage. Toward Amira. Robert's face drained of color. Diane looked around the room, desperately searching for a way to stop what was happening. Neither found one. Without a single word spoken between them, all 9 veterans came to attention, facing Captain Amira Brooks. For several long seconds, the ballroom was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Amira stood frozen beside her table, unsure what to do. Then Mr. Whitaker straightened his shoulders. Despite his age, the movement was precise. He raised his right hand in a crisp military salute. The other 8 veterans followed immediately. No one had coordinated it. No one had planned it. They simply understood. Amira instinctively returned the salute. Around the room, guests looked from the veterans to Amira, realizing they were witnessing something far more significant than an ordinary wedding toast. As the salutes ended, several civilians slowly rose from their chairs as well, not because they understood every military tradition, because they recognized genuine respect when they saw it. The applause that almost began faded away when Diane hurried toward the microphone. "This isn't appropriate," she said, forcing a nervous smile. "Today is Emily's wedding. Everyone, please, let's sit down." No one moved. Robert stepped beside her. "We appreciate Captain Brooks' service, but this really isn't the time." Mr. Whitaker calmly looked at both of them. "With respect," he said, "there is never a wrong time to honor someone who spent years protecting people they had never met." The room remained still. Robert opened his mouth to object again. Emily quietly placed a hand on his arm. "Let him finish." Her father looked at her in disbelief. She didn't remove her hand. Mr. Whitaker turned back to the guests. "Many of you are probably wondering why several veterans stood without hesitation." He smiled toward Amira. "We didn't stand simply because she's an army captain." He paused. "We stood because we recognized the medal." He took a careful breath before continuing. "Several years ago, during a humanitarian evacuation overseas, Captain Brooks coordinated rescue operations after a series of devastating attacks left civilians trapped without safe routes out." Guests leaned forward. The situation changed by the hour. Roads became unsafe. Communication failed repeatedly, and families were separated across multiple evacuation points. Amira lowered her eyes. She had spent years trying not to relive those days. Captain Brooks organized the logistics that kept those evacuation routes open. Convoys moved because she found safe alternatives. Medical teams reached people because she refused to abandon the operation. And dozens of civilians made it home alive. The ballroom remained completely silent. A retired army sergeant stepped forward. "My son was assigned to that mission." He looked directly at Amira. "He came home because the convoy she coordinated reached his unit before supplies ran out." His voice caught briefly. "I've wanted to thank the officer responsible for years." Another veteran spoke next. "My daughter was one of the military nurses evacuated during that operation." He smiled through wet eyes. "She still talks about the officer who refused to leave until every medical vehicle had crossed safely." He turned toward the guests. "That officer was Captain Brooks." Whispers spread across every table. "Why didn't we know this? I thought she worked in an office. Didn't her parents say she just traveled for work?" Relatives began looking toward Diane and Robert instead of toward Amira. Questions multiplied faster than anyone could answer them. Emily slowly set down her champagne glass. Pieces of her childhood suddenly fit together. The promotion ceremony her parents never attended. The missing photographs. The way conversations always changed whenever Amira's deployments came up. The endless reminders that Emily was the family's success while Amira was simply doing her thing. Emily turned toward her parents. Neither would meet her eyes. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room was already listening. "Mom?" Diane looked up. "Dad?" Robert swallowed. Emily's expression shifted from confusion to heartbreak. "What else have you been lying about?" No one answered Emily. Diane stared at the floor. Robert looked toward the stage as though searching for someone, anyone, to change the subject. Instead, Mr. Whitaker quietly returned the microphone to his lips. "I believe your daughter deserves to hear the rest." Neither parent objected this time. They couldn't. The room had already decided to listen. Mr. Whitaker looked at Amira before continuing. "Captain Brooks would never tell you this herself." A faint smile crossed Amira's face. He wasn't wrong. During that evacuation, every route changed by the hour. Intelligence reports were incomplete. Communications failed repeatedly. Entire communities were trapped between active conflict and rising floodwaters after a damaged dam gave way. He paused. The easiest decision would have been to pull everyone back. But Captain Brooks refused to abandon the civilians who were still waiting. He looked around the ballroom. She reorganized supply routes, redirected transport convoys, and coordinated military engineers, medical teams, and local emergency responders under impossible conditions. Every decision had consequences. If she guessed wrong, he let the sentence fade. No one needed him to finish it. The Distinguished Service Medal wasn't awarded for one brave moment. It was awarded because she kept making the right decisions when every decision carried enormous risk. The retired Army sergeant stepped beside him. "My son told me something after he came home." He looked directly at Amira. He said the officer running logistics never acted like a hero. He said she walked through every command post asking one question: "Who still needs help?" He smiled. "I've remembered those words ever since." The retired nurse's father spoke next. "My daughter said Captain Brooks wouldn't board the final aircraft until every medical team had been accounted for." He shook his head. "Most people never learn the names of the officers who make those decisions. We did. And we never forgot." Several veterans nodded in agreement. None of them had planned to speak. They simply couldn't stay silent after recognizing the medal. Mr. Whitaker stepped away from the microphone. Then, without saying another word, he began applauding. One pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, every veteran joined him. The applause spread across the ballroom table by table. Soon all 180 guests were standing. The sound echoed through the reception hall. Amira had stood through military ceremonies before. She had accepted awards. She had received formal commendations. None of those moments compared to this. Not because strangers were applauding, because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't being asked to hide what she had accomplished. She blinked several times, trying unsuccessfully to hold back tears. Emily crossed the ballroom. Without hesitation, she wrapped both arms around her sister. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Amira hugged her back. "You have nothing to apologize for." Emily pulled away just enough to look at her. "I believed what they told me. So did everyone else. I should have asked more questions. You were a kid." Emily shook her head. "I'm asking now." The sisters embraced again, as many guests quietly wiped away tears of their own. The applause finally faded. Almost immediately, relatives began approaching Diane and Robert. An aunt spoke first. "You told us Amira wasn't interested in military ceremonies." Another relative added. "You said she preferred staying out of the spotlight." A cousin frowned. "We didn't even know she'd received one of the nation's highest military decorations." Robert opened his mouth, closed it, then finally sighed. "We thought." His voice faltered. "We thought if people focused on Amira's military career." He looked toward Emily. "Every family event would become about her." Diane quietly continued. "We kept telling ourselves we were protecting Emily." Emily turned toward them. "I never asked you to do that." Silence. Her mother wiped away tears. "We also knew." She struggled to finish the sentence. "That people would eventually ask why we'd spent years treating our most accomplished daughter like she didn't matter." No one argued. There was nothing left to deny. The truth had spoken for itself. Later that evening, when it came time for the bride's final speech, Emily requested the microphone one last time. "I've thanked my husband." She smiled at him. "I've thanked our families." Then she turned toward Amira. "But there's one person I almost overlooked because I spent too many years believing someone else's version of her story." She waited until her sister looked up. "My sister has spent her life serving people she'll probably never meet again. My wedding is better because she's here. My life is better because she's my sister. And from this day forward, if anyone asks me who the bravest person in our family is," Emily smiled through tears, "I won't hesitate. It's Captain Amira Brooks." The ballroom erupted into applause once more. This time, Amira didn't look toward her parents. She looked toward her sister. The months that followed changed the family forever. Some relatives chose to keep their distance from Diane and Robert, unable to forget how easily they had hidden the truth for so many years. Family gatherings became smaller, quieter, more honest. Emily and Amira began meeting for dinner whenever their schedules allowed, building the relationship they should have had long before the wedding. For the first time, they talked without anyone comparing them, without anyone choosing favorites. Amira continued attending military ceremonies, wearing the same dress uniform her parents had once called embarrassing. She never hid the Distinguished Service Medal again. Not because she wanted attention, because she finally understood there was a difference between seeking praise and refusing to erase part of who she was. She stopped waiting for her parents' approval. She no longer needed it. The uniform her parents said wasn't welcome at her sister's wedding didn't take attention away from the bride. It simply revealed, in front of everyone, who had spent years carrying the family's greatest honor, and who had spent even longer trying to hide it.